Hi, folks. Welcome to the Hot Zone. This is Chuck Holton. And over the last week, I was out with the power company here in West Virginia, helping them try to get the lights back on for something like 100,000 customers who were without power. And that's because there was a big ice storm up here. We saw another enormous ice storm, the ice extravaganza, I think you'd call it, down in Texas, that left millions of people without power. And it's one thing when you go without power for a few hours, a few minutes, even a day or so. But when it gets into a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks without power, especially when you're talking about freezing temperatures, people start to die. And I think it bears paying attention to what happened down in Texas, where we did see people die from hypothermia. And the media is spending, I think, all of its time trying to figure out who's to blame for this. But I think that's the wrong question to ask because if you are like me, you understand that there are 1,000 different reasons why the power grid could go down tomorrow that we just can't plan for. The fact that we live in such a complex system, our power grid system, our system of just in time inventory delivery, our system of even how our food gets to our table, because most of the food that we rely on comes from very far away. We don't eat locally very much anymore. And so it doesn't really necessarily have to be an ice storm. Here in West Virginia, back in 2007, we had what they called a derecho, just a stiff wind that blew through here, and it knocked down power lines and left some people without power for up to 2 weeks. Now, if you're a healthy, young, well-adjusted American, you're probably going to be okay, even if you have to go without power for a couple of weeks. In that case, in 2007, it was not in the middle of winter, so that was helpful. You didn't have to worry about heat. But uh, if you are diabetic, if you're on oxygen, if you even just need certain prescriptions filled, uh, going without power for a longer period of time, more extended period of time of a matter of weeks, is something that could literally be the difference between life and death. And so I just want to take this last segment of the week to encourage you to take a look at your preparations. And I'm not talking about going all doomsday prepper on you, but think about the fact that what would happen if we didn't have power for a week or a month? Because that happens. It happens here in the first world, in the United States of America. And it happens more often than we'd like to admit. And there are reasons out there why it could happen in the future that could potentially knock out our power grid in such a catastrophic way that we might be without power, not just for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, but for many months going into years. And that's something that we should all sit back and think about for a minute because it's important that if you are a man, you have the responsibility of looking down the road and saying, how do I provide for my family? I'm walking point for my family. What do I need to do to make sure that we can at least survive if the worst were to happen? So I want you to take a look at this last segment of our series that I did a few years ago called The Fight for Light. And I hope that it spurs some deep thought on your part and that you'll get prepared just in case. I'm Chuck Holton. This is the Hot Zone.
In our last two episodes of Frontlines, we explored the weaknesses in our aging power infrastructure and the devastating effect EMP would have on all Americans and our way of life. In this third and final chapter of our series, our experts issue a dire warning for the American people.
You know, 100 years ago, the people that would have been sitting on these very steps eating their breakfast wouldn't have thought it was strange if you had 6 months' food in your basement. But today, that's weird because our just-in-time delivery system allows us to get our food from thousands of miles away every single day. But what that means is that most major cities only have about a 3-day supply of food. So if the system goes down, people start going hungry almost immediately.
According to the National EMP Commission review, it has 2 estimates of the number of people who would die from lack of food, lack of water, lack of medicine, lack of everything you have that depends on electricity directly or indirectly. One of the Commission's recommendations or assessments was that 2/3 of the people of the United States would die within a year. The other assessment is that 90% would die within a year. So this is not something we can really deal with by individuals fixing just what concerns them. We have to deal with it as a society.
EMP is a high-tech way of killing people the old-fashioned way. Starvation is an old-fashioned way of killing people, disrupting your societal infrastructures, like what the barbarians used to do against the Romans. You know, when the barbarians figured out that they could attack Rome by pulling down the aqueducts, the population of Rome in a generation fell from 1 million people to less than 15,000. So in effect, we're facing the new barbarians of the 21st century, except instead of using large numbers of men and oxen to pull down aqueducts, you know, they've got the possibility of doing nuclear EMP attacks, cyber attacks, physical sabotage, all used in combination. It's a new way of warfare that combines all these things. The Russians originated the concept, but the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians have all copied it.
One thing's for sure, the very fact that the U.S. power grid is so vulnerable to EMP all but invites America's enemies to try and exploit these weaknesses.
Ballistic missile defenses that the United States has, such as they are, because we've cut back over the years, are pretty much all rigidly focused toward the north, because the Soviet Union was the problem, and we wanted to make sure that if they launched at us, we would get warning. But the Soviets came up with an idea back during the Cold War that unfortunately they've shared with the North Koreans, and I rather imagine the North Koreans have shared with the Iranians, which they called a fractional orbital bombardment system, or FOBS, which meant that they would launch a satellite and have it head south in its polar orbit rather than north. So if it starts out heading south and then comes at the United States after it's gone around the Earth and is coming up from the southern hemisphere, there aren't any radars or sensors or anything facing that direction that could pick it up.
On the very day of the Metcalfe Transformer Substation attack, a North Korean satellite called the KSM-3 went around the South Pole and approached the United States from the south and overflew this country on the optimum trajectory to evade our national missile defenses, to do a surprise EMP attack on our country as an exercise. They obviously didn't actually do the attack, but they pulled it off perfectly. And so when that satellite swung over the South Polar region, the first warning we would get would be the EMP burst itself. And that satellite passed over us several times. On one of the passes, it could have put a peak EMP field over all 48 contiguous United States, which would have fried the grid everywhere if it had been a nuclear weapon. On another one of the passes, on the April 16th pass, actually, it overflew Washington, D.C. and New York City and could have put a peak EMP field on our political and economic capitals and taken down the eastern grid. That's really all you need if you want to destroy this country. If you just take down the eastern grid, that's where most of our people live. That's where 75% of our electricity is generated. And coincidentally, while the eastern grid was under simulated attack by a nuclear EMP attack from North Korea, parties unknown on that same day were attacking the Metcalfe Transformer Substation, which is an important part of the western grid. Had they taken those transformers out, it might well have had cascading failures that could have collapsed the whole western grid.
The level of urgency is extremely great because North Korea has been told by the Russians told us how to conduct a fractional orbital bombardment system, South Polar launch. They have nuclear weapons and they have ballistic missiles that are capable enough to put something in orbit. It doesn't have to be sophisticated to get into orbit. Some people would say you could put a 100, 200-pound nuclear weapon in orbit with a weather balloon. Of course, the really troubling one, I think, is Iran, which doesn't have a nuclear weapon yet, but the agreement we are negotiating with them does not, in my view, slow them down appreciably at all. So once the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, they already have ballistic missiles and launch vehicles such that they can get into orbit. And so they are a nuclear weapon or two test away from having the capability to do what their leader Khamenei says regularly he wants to do, which is to destroy Israel and to destroy the United States.
Our country is not prepared for it, not just at a technical level, but at a doctrinal and psychological level. Our people are not thinking that way. Our people who are expert on EMP, for example, don't talk to the people who are experts on cyber operations. Neither of them talk to people who are experts at physical sabotage, like the Green Berets and Special Forces. And the guys who work with non-nuclear EMP weapons don't talk to anybody. You know, they're all in their little stovepipes. It's a failure of strategic imagination, potentially catastrophic failure of strategic imagination, comparable to what we did before World War II.
Those of us who are trying to alert people to the fact that you have to deal with a really horrible threat like this feel as if sometimes we're toying with being in a situation where, oh my God, here he comes again. Nobody wants to hear him. A few people, I hope, will listen and get something done, because this is not technologically all that sophisticated. We know with various types of surge protectors and other devices how to at least do the basics on some of the big transformers, so we could at least have something we could rebuild from.
What we're talking about now was deeply classified when I was working at the CIA, and you weren't able to talk about it with the public. It might leak into the press, the notion of an EMP every now and then, but there were no extensive studies that were out there. And it wasn't until the EMP Commission declassified its reports for the public, because we realized that it wasn't enough to tell the military and the intelligence community. We had to educate the people and the civilian critical infrastructures, the electric power industry, communications. These things are run by the private sector, not by the government, and they had to understand the threat in order to protect against it.
The transmission grid should be a national security issue. The threats are real, the damage can be significant, and it is vulnerable.
We need to regard all of our electronic warfare vulnerabilities as something that we have to deal with, and deal with quickly. It is not a matter just for troops on the battlefield. And it's not a matter that just affects us abroad. It is a vulnerability of you and your next door neighbor.
America's power infrastructure is sorely unprotected. As you've seen, there are experts doing all they can to spur Congress to harden the grid and prevent anarchy. Remember, the First Amendment to our Constitution gives you the right to demand action, and the Second Amendment gives you the right to protect your family. I'm Oliver North for Frontlines.
Okay, folks. Well, thanks for watching this week. It's been a really interesting week for me, doing things that I've never done before, and pretty enjoyable, actually, kind of doing something different. Next week, I am going to Colombia, so I'll be reporting back to you on the immigration issue from Colombia, the Venezuelan issue from Colombia, and maybe a few other things that we're cooking up down there. I'm going to be there for almost 2 weeks, so we'll have a lot of reporting from Colombia coming up. And so stay tuned, invite your friends. Make sure you go over to our Telegram channel. Just do a search for the Hot Zone podcast on Telegram. I'm sharing a lot of extra stuff over there. And so if you're not over there on Telegram, you're missing out. Telegram allows me to not just put up videos, but to also put up text and news items and things that I can't do a full podcast about, but that you need to know about to have good ammunition to talk to your friends around the water cooler and to keep your family safe. Also, don't forget that we've got a trip going to Armenia in the first week of May, and you are all welcome to come along. Well, we've got a few spaces left anyway. And so it's $899 plus your airfare for a week in Armenia, and I guarantee you it's going to be absolutely once in a lifetime memorable. We're going to go around to some really incredible places. And so if you want to know more about that, I'll put the link here in the show notes right below. So check it out. Thanks for watching the Hot Zone. We'll see you again next week. Have a good weekend.